start? Yes.
It's at least it double checks, right?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's not live.
We're live.
Okay, we are live, I think now.
All right.
we
At least it double checks.
Yeah. Hello. There is I don't know if it's people on the chat. Um okay.
Let me share. I'm resharing just to make
Okay,
sure
some
it's.
people. Hi Matthias.
Oh, hey, good morning.
Morning. Okay, I'm just gonna remove my headphones from the other screen so I
Okay.
don't listen through
Yeah,
sounds.
don't hear the delay, right?
Okay, so let's start. Welcome to the Regan Bodies podcast, and thank you, Brad, to come in this. Hi, Matthias.
Oh, hey, good morning.
Just okay, just making the introduction, and I'm start listening myself on the.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, so thank you so much for coming, and please introduce yourself.
Sure thing. I'll save you. Good
Thank
morning.
you.
Well, as you can see, I'm Brad Clark, and currently one of the co-founders of Rigging Dojo and general troublemaker um, slash troubleshooter, I guess. But yeah, thanks for having me on. It's it's always nice to get to talk to people that you've like texted back and forth with online for forever. It feels like, but then you don't ever have time to just sit and have a conversation. So I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always. I mean, I think the podcast for me, it's just an excuse to have this conversation with people I always want to talk, but you never have the time or the right
Right.
excuse to do the geek talk that we all
Exactly.
love. So
Yes.
okay, let's do this stream, and so we have an excuse. That's
Yes,
it.
that's right. That's right. That's a good
Yeah, you
excuse.
want to do something, just look for a good excuse, and boom, you have it.
That's right.
So thank you so
Well,
much. So, okay, so do you mind if we start like a little bit with the story about the rigging dojo and
sure.
how do
Yeah,
you
we can
come?
start there and go
Yeah.
back. So I think to start talking about Regan Dojo is really just looking back at the industry and at the time, my co-founders Josh Carey and Chad Moore. There's Chad and Josh. We were all working either together or having conversations about trying to get staff. Right, we either couldn't find someone to hire, or I mean, it's honestly not that different now. Just rigging TDs in general are sought after. The good ones usually are already employed, and people need them for projects, and it's really hard, especially when you're trying to scale, to find people that are ready to go, right? Like,
Yes.
um,
I
and
know.
also, when you're so at that time, we were all in positions where we were trying to find people to hire, or had just been having difficulty getting reliable character riggers to give work to.
So
And
sorry to interrupt
yeah,
you.
go
So you
ahead.
was working each of the founders in a different company, and you were
Yes.
friends and was talking like we need to hire people, and oh me too, me too. So it was kind of
Yeah,
like
exactly.
okay.
Yeah, and that was so, we started having these conversations back and forth, and at the time, I had been doing more training and consulting on the side. I had stepped away from full-time production and uh, was kind of mixed between freelance and training, and my friend Josh was also doing some tutorials and training the studio he was at, but he was also being asked to do some video training as well. And Chad had been in the trenches at Sony for a long time on the mocap stage, and moved up to management and dealing with a large staff and training issues as well. And Chad and I had taught together at Full Sail, and so we he and I had previous teaching experience, and kind of kept looking out at the industry and trying to find out who's doing training well, and how do we fill this gap between kids coming out of school and
Hmm.
people, well, and not just graduates, but people that are on the job also that
Yeah.
are just stuck in production,
Yeah.
right? So if you're
Yeah.
if you're at
Yeah.
a
No.
small game studio, there's no source of how do I expand beyond myself when I'm stuck in a small studio that may not have access to more work that will push you, right?
Hmm.
So
Yes.
that's where we started talking and realized that all three of us had the same desire and needs, and we went, okay, well, instead of all three of us doing separate stuff, why don't we team up and look at how we can serve the industry and selfishly get people that we can hire ourselves.
Yeah.
How can we make a
Yeah.
pool of
No
people for
jokes on
us?
that. I think. I mean, we are at Studio Anima. We are right now looking for riggers,
Yeah,
and it's. I mean, literally here in Japan, there is no enough riggers.
right.
No. No
Yeah,
jokes. No.
yeah.
There is not enough.
If they were the other problem is that I think a lot of people, including myself, the other source of this was, I think Chad, Josh, and I all came from having to learn um, through a lot of struggle and a lot of misinformation, or not even misinformation, but just one person figures out one thing at a studio, and then
Hmm.
that becomes what you know,
Hmm.
and you get comfortable with, and then it was not a lot of people were sharing technical information.
Yes, I.
Jason and some of the master classes were great, and there were a core group of people on 3D Pro and a few
Yeah.
mailing lists that were the main source for everything,
Yes, I.
and then that was it. Like you
Yeah.
could glean little bits of information, but if you didn't know that was there and you weren't capable of kind of self teaching, then it was really
Yeah,
hard.
we do you remember the David Gallagher, the
Yes.
VHS
Yep.
tapes?
Yeah. Yeah,
That
those were
was
great. Those early
gold.
soft homage guys, right? Like it was like, oh,
Yeah,
someone's doing something and sharing it.
I
Okay, let's
yeah,
all sit around the campfire.
I remember my boss back in the days. He bought the tapes. It
Yes.
cost a ton of money because
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean overseas 20 years ago,
Yes.
it was like a fortune, and I
Yeah.
was watching it like over and over. I didn't break it, but it was close.
Well, what's funny about that is, I think David Gallagher at the time, like him and Jeremy Byrne, were like the two soft homage VHS tapes that had training, right? Like,
Yeah.
uh, and a website and information, and David Gallagher would publish something in I think 3D Artist or one of the CG, one of the magazines that would come
Uh-huh.
out,
Yeah.
and you'd go, ooh, what's like, part one of four tutorials, and you'd hold on to those. I think I still have some in my closet somewhere where I just ripped
Yeah.
the pages out and stacked them in there, and every once in a while I look through it and go, God, this really hasn't changed in 20 years. But the funny story is, so Chad and I were teaching at Full Sail, and one of our students went to the Philippines
Mm-hmm.
to work at an animation company,
Mm-hmm.
and then he started reaching back to say, well, I have all these 2D animators. I need people to come train.
Mm-hmm.
And so he brought David Gallagher down, and he helped set up a soft mosh pipeline for these guys. And
Oh
then
wow.
Chad went down and was learning with David Gallagher, and he and I knew soft mosh because we were at the time we were teaching both Power Animator and Softimage, and then Maya came along. So he and
Wow.
I started on Alias Power Animator, and then and like Animation Master,
Mm-hmm.
and then we were like, I think again Raf Anzevin was one of the other, like,
Yes, he
in
was
industry
in the
started.
animation
It
master.
was
Yeah.
like when I learned that he was, I was pretty young at the time when I started doing this stuff, and then I saw what Raph was doing, and I was like, "Are you kidding? He's like 12." It was just he was so much younger, even and doing all
12
this
years old?
stuff.
No, no
No,
kidding.
I mean he
Huh.
was really young, publishing tutorials
Wow.
and working Animation Master. Not maybe not 12. Sorry, Raph. I don't remember exactly how young you were, but it was just there were maybe five or six people in the world that you would consistently see sharing stuff, and
Yes.
you'd anybody that was publishing tutorials, you'd hold on to that stuff forever, or you'd go to a master class when it was, that was the sole
Yeah.
time people shared a class or information, and that was through the the CD-ROM PDF discs.
Yeah.
Someone
Yeah. It's
someone at Disney would come along and share like, "Hey, we're doing ribbon rigging," or like there would be this one little gem, and then it would be everywhere because you could see people like, oh, someone sees something new, and then it just spreads out, right?
Yeah, I think it changed quite a lot from. I remember spending a ton of money like buying books or
Yeah.
asking people to buy books if they visit the States, or because
Yes.
I'm from Spain. I mean, if you think it was hard in the States, imagine
Yeah.
in Spain we don't have SIGGRAPH or any
Right.
in but
Yeah.
like was no 3D industry in 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, so that's and when we circle back to the founding of Rigging Dojo, it was Animation Mentor was starting to teach online, and honestly, it was the number of people learning animation and the number of sources for good animation training
Hmm.
was already starting to kind of hit online, but there still was not really anything dedicated to rigging. There were a
Yeah.
few people sharing some stuff in Studio Max,
Yeah.
and some early rigging tutorials there. Paul Neal. There's a handful of people that I consistently went back to learn from. So I would say probably, we were talking before this started that we kind of started in the industry officially around 2000, right? Like for me, I was doing some freelancing and teaching, and then in 2000 I moved
Hmm.
here to Austin and started at Acclaim Studios. And what the funny part about that is I had been um, teaching Maya and had transitioned to Maya and was feeling comfortable in it. I hadn't touched, or I didn't really know about Motion Builder. I still was using Softimage some, and when I interviewed, the studio was looking to switch from Studio Max to Maya, and so I was like, okay, great, I can help with that. I can help with training, and also I've been rigging in Maya a little bit and
Hmm.
working on stuff, and there's all this stuff going on, but like, okay, I'm ready to go. And between the time I interviewed and actually they hired me and I came to town,
Hmm.
they decided to go with Studio Max. So I my
What a
they're like well, all right, you're gonna start on the sports team, and also we're gonna put you on the mocap team, but you're gonna start. For now, we don't have anything to do yet, so you need to learn
yeah.
the software, and also we need people building stadiums for the sports games. So
Oh,
doing that in Studio Max, good luck. It was like, oh, okay,
yeah. That
that was
happened to
that was
me.
a
Similar situation. I was hired to like a CG soup slash start the 3D department in one company in Barcelona,
yeah,
and like it was like okay, we start in 2 months, and I
yeah,
took a little gig for 5 weeks
yeah.
in France, and supposedly we was about to use Softimage,
Hmm.
and when it come back, it was they bought a Maya license.
Yeah, it was. The other funny story about that is I the motion capture software, like for people who don't know, Acclaim Studios basically like the motion capture system that became giant and that powered Lord of the Rings
Oh,
came out of Acclaim,
oh,
and they
I
had
know.
a capture studio in New York, and the biomechanic engineers that started some of the first motion capture for games. That was that studio. So
Wow.
when I got hired, the motion editors had old SGI machines at their desks, and they were running the software called Nuance, and I was shown it, and I'm okay, we're going to learn it. And at the same time, the support staff had quit wanting to work with SGI, so they were trying to get rid of them. And also, Giant had broken off to be its own studio, so they were looking for alternatives to this custom software that they'd been using forever,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, and so I kind of got roped into these early meetings with Kadera at the time. They were coming down to do training for Filmbox, and the motion editors were looking at using Filmbox, but uh, the problem was that it wasn't ready yet, and we needed more SGI machines for the motion editing
Mm-hmm.
artists and the animators. And I had worked on SGI systems at Full Sail, and my friend Andrew was the sysadmin, and he had gone to PDI.
Mm-hmm.
and was out there. So like the first week, one, I was learning Studio Max on the job and trying to figure out how to like build environments and these massive stadiums, and I couldn't understand why everything was a triangle in Max. And then the other part of my day was trying to learn the motion capture software, but none of the SGI
Wow.
machines worked. So I called my friend and was basically in the computer room, like the graveyard of SGI machines,
Hmm.
opening up boxes and just pulling pieces together to rebuild working SGIs
Oh
and
wow.
reinstalled Linux
It's
or
like
reinstall
scavenger
iRigs. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Wow.
exactly. And so they're like, well, okay, does anybody know how to do this? I'm like, well, I kind of do. So like the first few weeks was just like
That's,
this is not at all what I was expecting when I started this job, but it worked out for the
yeah,
best. But
I think
yeah.
yeah, I think it was quite exciting. It looks like for me like now it looks like everything. Yeah, you open the internet, you check this,
Yes.
and boring.
Yeah, yeah, right. Oh, you want to learn something? Just search it on YouTube, and you've got 14
Yeah.
hours of
Oh yeah.
information. But yeah, so it was just I call my friend and I'm like, hey, is this how you reinstall iRigs on a SGI? Like I pulled the hard drive out of one, and I got, like I
Oh
just
yeah.
we're building these boxes, and I ended up getting I think 4 working machines ready for the other animators, and
Yeah.
so we started working on that, and then we started getting a look at Filmbox at the time, and it was very different compared to Nuance, and also Studio Max, or even right like people were looking at biped and animating things, but Motion Builder slash Filmbox was real time, so that was
Yes.
awesome. Like it was, you could do things, and it also felt like Softimage to me, because the early key mapping was very similar to
Mm-hmm.
Softimage,
Y-
and it was amazing watching people. For me anyway, it was like, oh, this makes sense. I can pick this up pretty quick. And other people that had only ever used Max or had
yeah.
never experienced Optimage, it
Yeah.
was just they were frustrated and struggling. And I was like, oh no, this is, I see, this really feels like it could have
Yeah.
been a plugin.
Yeah, we was talking before starting the stream that yeah, I've been. I mean, I was using like Filmbox in yeah, it was 2000. Yeah, and the thing was, I was hired as an animator,
Yeah,
but I was like, I mean, I always liked the technical side of the thing, so I was
yeah,
very technical savvy. So I was pretty horrible animator. Like, yeah, they hired me. I mean, and I've been animator for a few years, so but I consider myself like pretty bad animator. Like I never had the I don't know how to say, but I never get in the flow for animation.
yeah,
And they saw me like, oh, you technical savvy. Do you mind to take care of the motion capture system on the studio? That because the guy who is taking care is gonna leave to another company.
yep,
And I said, yeah. And I remember, yeah, in a few days, it was up and running with the film box,
yeah,
and the system we had there was like a magnetic system from
yeah,
Ascension. I don't
yep,
know,
yeah,
and then you need to rest like every 20 minutes, or I don't remember, but it was like a terrible thing. And
yeah.
super small room. We had a super small room for that,
Oh my
and
gosh.
yeah, and yeah, I think probably there is when I start like very seriously, like more like going to Regan and technical side of the things. But it was so fun,
Yeah,
and we was this the same animators that put the suit and
yep.
capture yourself, and yeah,
That's
we
actually, I mean, that's not a bad. It's actually kind of nice that that was the experience, right? Because early mocap stuff was, you either had a good support team, studios, and everything was good, and you had a process,
mm-hmm,
and we're all in, or it was just a fight, right? No one wanted to do it, but I think now it's not too uncommon that animators are getting in the suit and either blocking out something. Like there's it's
yeah,
such a, for so long it was, oh, mocap is terrible and evil, and who would ever use that? It's not
mm-hmm,
animation. And then like the reality of production hit, and it's like, right, well, we need to get all this stuff done, it needs to look consistent, and it to be at a certain level. And oh, by the way, like, you know it's really easier to motion capture cameras than it is to try to hand animate them and have it feel right, or have have realistic CG characters acting along other people. You need a base reference that is more than just video reference of the animator acting out stuff. So like I
Yes.
think the transit, it's nice that the transition um, to accepting it as just another part of the process for the
Yeah.
most part has gone
Yeah. But
better, right?
yeah, yes.
There's less like, oh, this is just evil. It's just no one cares, right?
Yeah.
Like they get reference of some
Yeah.
kind and work.
Yeah. I remember in a previous company and here in Japan, we get one of these. I don't remember. It's very lightweight sensors, like motion sensors that you can
Yeah.
use it outside without cameras or anything. I don't
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
the name of the company. And yeah, the animator was like, instead of they had this system and the camera, so they can go shoot
Yeah.
themselves for reference, or
Yep.
they sometimes just wear the suit, go two animators, one with a laptop and the other with the suit,
Yeah.
and they did his stuff outside,
Yeah.
with taking maybe the urban
Yeah.
mobiliary and things like that, and they was like having a great time doing that, and
Yeah.
yeah, that's cool stuff.
Well,
Also,
what's
yeah.
one of the things, right? Like, the my other frustration though is that you and I are talking about this process and the software and I'm looking at Motion Builder now and it's improved a little bit, but for the most part the core tools and the process and the stuff that we're doing now is the same stuff we did in 2000. It's the same
Yes.
foundation that was built and being used in
Yeah.
1995 or 94 and and we're starting to see some advancements now in Maya and some other
Mm-hmm.
software to try to get real-time interactivity
Mm-hmm.
and faster playback, but um, it's like it's a new concept or something, but it's been this way from the beginning in Filmbox, right? Like it's just
Yeah.
everything was real time. So it's just a weird concept of seeing
Yeah.
people like,
And
oh yeah, I miss play blasting because I use it for and just like, what? Okay, yeah, that you
oh
don't
no, the
stop play
people is
blasting if
complaining
it's
because
yeah,
no play blaster.
yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah. You're like, right, but
oh yeah.
also, what is this like slow? I have to wait for 30 seconds to move a control,
Yeah.
you have limitations, of course, but it's just it still is amazing to me. And I think when we hit some questions, Morgan had posted on Twitter about like what's changed and teaching, and we'll come back to that topic. But
Yeah.
it's still just amazing to me that the
Yeah.
transition and the improvement in other areas of the software and 3D field have been so massive, and it seems like for the most part the tech side we're still just surviving. Like we're
Yeah.
still just getting
I
stuff done.
yeah, I think for rigging, like it, what is rigging, like controls wise and for animators, it
Yeah.
didn't change that much. Like like it's more. I mean, there is way more complex, and you can have a lot of different stuff and
Right.
things like deformers and new solvers, and it's coming like things
Yes.
like for instance a delta mesh or things like
Right.
that, these kind of technologies. But what is the rig in itself, the
Yeah.
way that it's manipulated the character through
Right.
time, it didn't change that much, I
No.
think.
And it's not even I don't know, it's not a lack of desire, I don't think, on the rigging side, but I think the same way that I popped up Epic Mickey to make a connection back to
Mm-hmm.
Zoo Tools in a second, but the same way that for training, right? If we look at rigging and we look at animation, as soon as you start standardizing and having a lot of people learn from one source, that becomes both a benefit and a curse, because you end up thinking that how to do something is the only way to do something,
Yes.
or the you basically just accept that that's the way to do it,
Mm-hmm.
and you suddenly quit learning other ways. And I think the exciting thing I've seen, with watching Raf Ansman pushing his ephemeral rig
Yeah.
idea, is that you know and I've talked about this in the forums, is that the thing that I've always liked about the motion builder workflow and rigging workflow is that um, the rig and the interpolation, the rig and the solving, they're all decoupled.
Mm-hmm.
They're connected together in a relationship, but they are not bound so tightly together that you don't have any flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I manipulate and pose the character is completely independent from how that result gets to the next frame,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? So having that ability to separate those two, when I started talking to Raph about it
Mm-hmm.
early on, he was like, "Oh yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's pretty powerful, right?"
Mm-hmm.
He didn't like motion, really didn't want to deal with the control rig, but understanding that separation of how I manipulate a pose and get a character into the shape, right? Like, you wouldn't tell a traditional animator, well, you have to draw starting with the hips.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and if you want to move the hand or erase something, well, you have to first switch pencils
Mm-hmm.
entirely and get a new piece of paper and draw. Like the manual labor
Mm-hmm.
involved in just posing a regular rig is so
Yeah.
high
So.
because what you do affects how it
Mm-hmm.
gets to the next frame.
Because you're talking about the emotion builder, the human IK system.
Yes.
You have the manipulation that you can pull from the arm, IK
Yeah.
or rotate an FK, and everything is like seamless. Like you don't do like IK FK exchanges,
Right.
but internally it's solving different ways. Not thinking I have an IK and I have an FK. It's
Exactly.
solving
Yeah.
different.
It
No,
well,
it's
if you look at the foundation, right, it's a set of world space controls
mm-hmm,
to get nerdy, and then it's a hierarchy of FK. And whenever you keyframe,
mm-hmm,
those controls are synced. So
mm-hmm,
it's like, if I set a keyframe, it basically does an IKFK match on this frame for everything.
mm-hmm,
But then you have control over between this frame and the next, how those poses, how those keyframes get to
mm-hmm,
in between, right? Do you use IK? Do you use FK? But you always have a two stream system where you can go back and forth at any time for any part of the rig. But how I control with pinning, if I say I need the chest to stay still,
mm-hmm.
and I move the hips around, right? If I lock the chest, or if I rotate the hips, it's going to cause a different reaction
Yeah.
than when I. But this manipulation
Mm-hmm.
is completely independent of what happens in the timeline, and so having rigs that enable that are incredibly powerful,
Yeah.
and it doesn't carry over very well to other rigging solutions and rigging software choices. Um, if you don't understand that process, and for me, coming through learning this technique and learning the way motion builder works opened my eyes to this. And so when the first time I got to really experiment with this, like a lot of the rigs were doing IKFK switching, and we were doing some space switching stuff for hands, but on Epic Mickey,
Mm-hmm.
because it was the mandate and the challenge was you have a game character rig that needs to go to the engine. It needs to be on a Wii, and the limited resources, but also they expect us to match the 2D system, the 2D style
Mm-hmm.
of Mickey. So for me, that meant, okay, well, how do I build a rig that enables the animator to create poses, to squash and stretch, to manipulate Mickey as if it was a drawing, and still function as they expect for game animation, and to be able to work with tools. So, it was awesome to see Andrew showing off the new
Mm-hmm.
Zoo rigging tools,
Mm-hmm.
and it's working with the early version of the Zoo Space Switcher and some of the Zoo rigging tools. I prototyped the Mickey rig,
Oh.
and the custom pick walking. So the Mickey rig I built for Junction Point here in Austin
Mm-hmm.
ended up lasting through the production. It got copied for Oswald, and then they used the same set of rigs for the second game. But those were based around the early Zoo tools space switching system, so that the whole rig could switch into world space and not be stuck. So, for example, I just wanted the rig to be completely flexible the way it would be in Motion Builder. And then what it turned out, my friend who Jorma Auburn, he was using the rig and had a finished animation, and he was trying to fix a pose, and we made him a couple hotkey buttons to basically push all the Zoo space switches to world space, and then snap it back to a default rig configuration, pretty much the way you would use pinning in Motion Builder. And this allowed him to take a finished animation and basically separate all the rig controls from each other and fix his pose and then snap it back and keyframe it. And it let him seamlessly go in and update a pose without having to delete keyframes, without having to refix interpolation.
Nice.
And so that I watched him do this and I was like, oh my God, this is such a powerful workflow. And it was such an easy thing to implement that, it was beyond just, well, I'm space switching to make a hand follow a thing. It was allowing the rig to be posable and manipulatable like Motion Builder, where I could go to world space and fix anything I want at any time and push it back. And then of course now you see like Richard Glico and Raf and a lot of places are using, this idea. It's showing up more and more. But at the time it was like I hadn't seen anybody else use it that way. And it was pretty cool because then I was like, okay, well now I want this in, that concept is something I started talking to Josh with the CG Monks about when he was building the MRS, their rigging system and their rigging tools for the Morpheus at the time. I basically said, look, if you're going to build this rigging system, the rig itself really needs the space switching component as a core part of the functionality. It can't be an afterthought. So, he started designing the tools around that ability. And so when I've done a couple examples of posing with the MRS rig system, and the animation tools he built around it allow you to really quickly take your character in any pose and space switch it back out to be this independent hierarchy that you can fix any pose and pop it back the same way that we were doing on Epic Mickey. And it's just it's so nice to have that as a workflow.
Yeah, the MRS rig I didn't check yet. I know the Morpheus, of course, it's quite famous, but I didn't follow the advances on the MRS. That is the new system he's working now, not correct?
Yes, yeah. Let's see. I think I've got. So I'll show you real quick.
Just to recap a little bit. So here the point is like we separate completely. One thing is how you manipulate to get the pose, and the other is how you interpolate the poses.
Exactly.
That is the key.
That concept is nothing stops someone from using that outside of Motion Builder. It's just that's the core way that the software works. And so when I started applying those ideas outside of Motion Builder, it just made the process so much better, and it allowed the animators to take the rig and his previous workflow at the time was, well, I have to fix this. I'm not going to use an animation layer. I have to just delete the keys around it and try to fix it, and then I kind of have to blend it back into the poses that I kept, and it was a struggle when you have a finished animation that needs updating, right? Because at that point it's basically mocap. It's you have keys on every frame almost for certain things. You have a cartoony action that is wild and distorting the mesh, and you've done all this work to get it there, but to come back to it later and then try to figure out how the rig is interpolating and all of the different pieces of the rig and all the attributes and on a complex rig, this is the other thing that Raf fights for all the time is simplifying the number of sources data can come from, right? So if the hip is moving, it's because it's the hip. It's not because there's another layer above it, and then there's some other two controls looking like one, right? Or three controls looking like one.
Yes.
So being able to separate that concept in the rig is really powerful. And once he did that by using space switching, it was like, oh yeah, this just makes sense. Like I can I'm not scared of going back to an animation now, right? Like your fear of iterating is gone because it doesn't matter. You can just go, you know what, on this pose, I can do whatever I want to it. And, I'm not stuck with whatever control I've got. I can just fix it. I can just translate it here and move it and not break everything,
Yeah, it's a bit like a non-linear approach.
Yeah.
Where if you like more classical style, it's you go and it's quite linear in terms like you do your blocking, you do your refinement, and you do secondaries and so on, and then in some point of your animation, if you need to change a major pose, it's it's a problem because you already build so much on top. If you
Right.
use tools like animation layers and other things
Yeah.
and constraints and blah blah, at the end it's like you need to destroy quite a lot to
Right.
change.
Well, and the other thing that you know, I haven't been able to contribute much in the terms of like, I feel like I learned a lot from a lot of people, and I've been good at understanding a lot of software, and I'm not as good a coder or programmer as I should be. I'm not as good a character TD as I could be if that was what I do all the time. But my position being outside the industry has done two things. One, it allows me to watch and see all kinds of things that I wouldn't be able to because I'd be focused just on getting my job done. And it's allowed me to learn and see a lot of different workflows and a lot of different people's approaches, and also see the same problems over and over again. And so when I talk to Autodesk and work with them on Motion Builder, or I go to Epic Studios and talk to their animators and watch their workflow, or I sit and play with something at the house to figure out something for myself, I have a pretty wide range of information that I can collect and pull and resources to connect with. And so for me, I think when I see ideas like this, or I see the struggle of, I'm afraid as an animator to go in and mess with this because it's going to break so many things. When I find solutions to that, it's really satisfying.
Yeah.
and or when I enable an animator to, my friend Yorma and I have worked for Yorma Auburn, and he was my teacher at Full Sail a long time ago, and he and I worked together for years, and he was the reason I came to Acclaim. When he and I would work together on tools or rigging or animation, we constantly would come back to look at this and say, how do we make this less painful down the line to change, and also how do we make this process more interactive and more involved, and including concept art and trying to get things involved from the beginning. So I wanted to come back to this rig for a second, because this is and talking about separating the rigging from everything. The one thing that he and I did at Acclaim early on,
Mm-hmm.
when we moved to the next generation projects, the Red Star game and 100 Bullets, the studio was scaling up for these next gen projects, and they were still using Max, but we still had no tech department. So I was hired to do animation and ended up doing stadiums and building SGIs and working in mocap. And then I gained so much out of that process. When I went to work on a new team that wasn't doing motion capture, I still had tried to bring that stuff to the rigs and Max. And of course, as soon as someone sees that you're any level of technical, that's what you end up doing. So,
Yes,
I
I
started
know
building these.
that.
You have a list of animations to do, and you also have to get rigs done. So, and I was still supporting the mocap team. So for the last for 3 years of before Acclaim went under, I was basically on 5 teams at once. I was training people on Motion Builder and supporting the studio for their mocap pipeline workflow. I was teaching Studio Max artists Maya and helping get them transition, because one of our studios was a Maya, and that game came to Austin. And then I had a list of animations to do for Red Star, and I was also supposed to be rigging characters
Right.
and helping the other next gen team and working with the tech group that was building the game engine. So I rarely sat at my desk for more than an hour to do my own work, and would just wander the building like some kind of vagrant, a homeless person, just going from desk to desk fixing stuff. So obviously I couldn't get rigs done and do that. So I started working with my other friend, Steve Kelly, who at the time was learning Max script, and he and I were looking at Max rigging and trying to not use biped. And Cat was out at the time as an early rigging solution, but that still was crashing all the time. And so he and I started just building our own custom rigs in Max, and he and I would pair program. So he had more time and more experience coding than I did at the time. So he would start exploring what you could do in Max script, and I would prototype something in Max, so that when we sat together, he and I would walk through the prototype with him, and he would write the code up, and then he and I would pair program the rigging component, and then he and I would go test it separately for our teams because they had different requirements. So we it was a pretty cool experience to get to like co-build a rig together. Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah, it's always like I think this moments of exploration and I will say like creation in terms of technical side, it
yeah,
are really really great. Like I had like a few times also like this kind of experience where you go wild, try like funky rigging
yeah,
systems,
yeah,
and
yeah.
then you okay, let's like load the level and let's try to do something that it's like halfway between
Yeah.
very like new as much as you can and it's the people still understanding what's going on.
Right. Well, and that's the other barrier, right, of
Yeah.
moving forward is getting animators to accept the new whatever it is and break
Yes.
that workflow. So to kind of come back and I just want to wrap up this train of thought. So, he and I were building these systems, but at the time, the animators were basically being forced to rig themselves, and that created a problem for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And, thankfully, now, right? Like someone can go download M Gear and work at their studio and have a consistent source for how the rig is built, or go get the MRS system, or you know any number of auto rigging solutions out there to basically have a standard through the pipeline. But at the time, there was nothing like that in Max except for using biped, and so. The other problem was that we were small teams, and concept art was constantly outpacing everybody else. So looking at this character in Motion Builder, hopefully you can still see her.
Yes.
Um, so we started once we had the framework for the rigging tool in place. Um, my friend Yorma was the animation lead, and we had another person working on textures and someone else building models. Um, I would get the concept art as soon as possible and lay out a skeleton that seemed like it would function in their art, and then we would block it out with rough mesh, and I would skin it and hand it off to the animation team like the day the concept art got delivered, and then they would test it for range of motion and see if it worked how they wanted, and then anything that felt off we would push back to concept art that day and say, hey, you know what,
Yeah.
this design doesn't work, or this is a problem. And so we upped the iteration time as a group, as a team, and we're able to fix a lot of problems early on. So
Yeah.
now this character is designed by one of my friends, who Dave Levy, who's an awesome concept artist, and he's worked on huge films and all kinds of stuff. But he still is not a competent rigger, and so he had this little character design, and if you look real close, she doesn't even have fingers. He basically just roughed this mesh out and that wasn't sure how the feet would work. They have these interesting. If I can hide all the stuff here, the foot of this character is really strange, and so his concept art was, it was a cool concept, but again, the character wasn't really completely designed to function, and so I said, well, let me just rig the character up real quick and give it back to you so you can play with it. And then, of course, like being able to see it moving was pretty awesome. But it just in that conversation with him and rigging the character and handing it back to him as a FBX file for him to just be able to pose in Max.
Yes.
It was like, oh, right, I forgot.
Yeah.
That changed his thought process again. Like I said, if you had changed this little idea here, the iteration up front with concept art and allowing them early prototyping to rig is still something that's missing, and it's extremely powerful.
Yeah, it's cool you talk about this because one of I have a big backlog of ideas for tools to add to MGear or to make it like a
Yeah.
separated tools, and one of them is precisely this or similar to what you is talking here, like a tool that can allow you to rig and concept art at the same time. Something like
Right.
in the line of maybe like in Blender you have this cut box and cutter box and
Yes.
all the
Yeah.
and recently I saw one demo that you can model and they make some kind of procedural thing and you have
Yeah.
like a robots or maybe like here on the also the MRS rigging
Yeah.
system that you have the box thing
Yeah. Well, that's what Josh was working on designing. So
Yeah,
it's not, this image here basically shows that,
yeah,
he's got multiple legs, but the in the template stage, you can rough this mesh out into, you can build this mesh to be whatever shape you want,
hmm,
and then you can basically cook that to a low poly model and hand it off to concept. So,
yes,
the animator already has a box mesh ready to go, and then the modeling team and the concept art are working off of the same source,
yeah,
and the
exactly.
animation and the rig, everybody's looking at the same
Yeah.
proxy.
Yes, exactly. So what I was thinking is something like that, but more
Yeah,
aimed to really to concept art, to
yeah,
focus
yeah,
on the
they can
concept art where
rock
you
it out.
can
Yeah,
manipulate somehow, like maybe, and and then move
yeah,
at the same time, especially
yeah,
for mechanical design.
yeah.
Because I cannot talk too much on the project, but
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it's a thing that we have sometimes like designs like your friends
right.
they coming from 2D design and
Yeah, like how does this work in
and
3D?
yeah, exactly, and you found like, oh my god, that's not gonna work in a
Right.
thousand
Yeah,
years,
yeah,
and we cannot change too much the design, you
yeah,
know. And you try to balance, so yeah,
yeah.
but
And
yeah,
and
here
this
it's really cool, yeah.
it's a powerful workflow. But what was funny was it reminded me with working with him, just doing this example was it reminded him of how powerful that process was. That again, we were doing 15 years ago to just survive.
Yeah,
Like reminding him that like, hey, if you can take and we can block out with the quick rig tool in Maya, or if you've got a little more time, any of the auto rig tools, like you can get a semi skinned rigged character up and running and throw some motion capture on it and just see it moving and come to
yeah,
life and go,
yeah,
yeah, this
exactly.
design works or not in a few minutes versus like waiting until
Yes,
another team comes
absolutely.
back
Yes,
months later and
exactly.
goes, oh, this doesn't work.
It's because I'm listening also other podcasts like Art Cafe and
Yep.
the Collective podcast, and they are always talking about the evolution of the concept art, how it
Yeah.
changed in a few years from mainly 2D Photoshop
Yep.
to now almost like the most edge or top concept artists go straight in 3D,
Yep.
and I think the next step should be like you do it that it actually works. So like you're
Yeah.
saying, like
Yeah.
you concept and move at the same time, and you can provide like a more like high level.
Yeah.
Well, not, I don't think it's the word high level, but like your concept, it's also working in for real.
Yeah.
It's not like
Well,
a nice pose thing.
right. And I think the more the software goes to being real time, right? Like if you're modeling in ZBrush and then you have to export that out and you have to wait hours for Maya to update and handle it, and it's just the if the iteration time is not part of the workflow, if
Yes.
you have to go out of the software, if you have to wait for another person, if you're waiting on the software, then it's not going to happen. They're not, it's like trying to get people to use Slack when they have email or anything outside of their normal day, or developing a pipeline tool, right? Like if
Mhm.
that tool is not already part of their process, or it kind of works into what they're doing, if they have to go to another thought, you switch gears and go do something, that is going to be a failure point. It's going to be a pain point over and over again, no matter how pretty the interface is, because they're having to leave what they're doing mentally, right?
Yes.
Like if you're programming something and you get interrupted about like, oh, where are you going for lunch?
Oh
You've
god.
lost that hour, right? Like that interrupted programming time, you've lost it. Well, the same thing happens when you're in the flow for animation, or you're trying to get, if you're concept arting and you're drawing 40 characters, and then suddenly you have to stop and like worry about, well, did I export it correctly, or what's happening? I've sketched this mesh and now it's the wrong stuff. Like if you have to worry about any of that, it's already now a barrier for you to keep working and
Yes.
getting that stuff out of the way, so that yeah, you don't hand bad designs down the pipe. Or topology, I think, is the area that it used to be that you have to start with an amazing clean topology box model, and then you can sculpt, but you need to worry about topology from the beginning.
Mhm.
And 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 Bay Rate and those guys were like, yeah, do you really? I think topology tools are getting to a point where yes, you still have to kind of pay attention, but the worrying about topology at the beginning has moved to the end, right? Like
Yes.
that is a post-process step almost versus creating something. And in animation, we're not there yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're
Yeah, I
still
think it's a great point.
interpolation is the thing from the beginning you have to worry about, and instead of I don't care how it moves between poses later. I just need to be able to manipulate this thing. It needs to deform. It needs to look
Yeah.
right. I need the feedback.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I think for the ephemeral rigging stuff, or the way the motion builder works still is the way that it should be. You should be able to worry about pose and performance and not worry about how it goes from one frame to the next. Like
Yeah.
if I draw a picture on a piece of paper, I don't care what happens to that piece of paper when I flip it over. The next piece of paper is there.
Yes, absolutely.
It's not like I don't have to magically get the one piece of paper to transform into the next sheet of paper so that I can draw on it.
Mm.
It just exists as soon as I put my hand on that paper and draw or sculpt and pose the character. It is there, and I don't care what it was doing before, and I don't care what it's doing next. But so much of the systems are built on you have to care because the software is going to destroy
Yeah.
whatever you're doing.
Yeah, and also it come back again to the like we're saying, like the way that the people is used to work,
Yeah,
Raf with the ephemeral rig, and it's the way he works, and you see his animations and are
yeah.
fantastic. And I saw this process video he has, and it's
Hmm.
fantastic, and also it looks so fun to do it.
Yeah,
You know what I
yeah,
mean? Like you but at the same time, I show to animation to animators,
yeah.
and there's but they don't use the curve, and it's like, okay,
Right.
if I don't have curves, it's so it's always this kind of like barrier, like probably if
Yes.
they try it, they're gonna like it, but at the
Yeah.
beginning it's like, I'm not gonna jump.
Well, so you mentioned Blender early on, and I was going to
Yeah.
say, for me, I still am exploring it as a tool, but for my 11-year-old son, I showed him the new 2D animation tools, and being able to again, as soon as I'm on a frame, when I draw, that exists, and I don't care what happens beforehand. If I want to just create something and sketch it and have something happen,
Hmm.
then I've done that, and I don't care about interpolation. But when I hit play, this is what I get, right? And now I can go back in and do whatever I want. I can come here and draw another frame or whatever, and it's creating it as I go. And I haven't thought about anything except for I'm just drawing something. And when I showed this to my son and he started playing with it, like he basically just started animating and drawing and did a minute and a half film of like he was drawing over reference and finding resources and building this animation, and we basically just started using it and it was intuitive. Now I've also showed him how to do 3D stuff, and watching that same process and the struggles he's got to try to pose a character that is not that's basically fighting and counter to everything we just did in 3 seconds in the grease pencil
Yeah.
tool. It's exhausting, right? Like if I go, if I draw a frame, it
Hmm.
exists. It's auto keyed, but it also, if I go to this frame and I go mess with something, I change the drawing and I come back, it's this is still this drawing. I haven't
Yeah.
done anything to it, and having that separation is powerful. But then look, later on, right? I can come and I can go in and I can take this this frame and I can move it and mess with it, and I can let's see. I think I can noise it up, right? And then I can come back and at any point I can say, you know what? Now I care about interpolation. I can make a sequence, and now I've got animation that's blending. But I don't care about interpolation until I do. And each of these is now separated independently from the in the next. And when you go to Motion Builder, the ability to treat the timeline fairly the same way. When I go to manipulate this pose and I go to change something or keyframe it, because the rig is constantly syncing, I know that when I go to this pose, everything is there. It's like a drawing. When I go to this frame, everything is there the same way you would in Maya if you were keyframing everything. But because it's doing that behind the scenes, you quit thinking about it. It's not, did I key everything? No, you just know that that's your pose, and whatever I do here on this frame is not going to break the pose back here.
Yeah. I was talking
And that's powerful.
I was talking with Raf also few months ago,
Yeah.
talking about an idea that I had for a tool like a timeline that you can split things, and
Hmm.
it put me off of the idea with this argumentation. Like, I mean, I don't want to go and have like ton of layers thinking
Right.
on one simple. This is my pose, and
Yeah.
it's very so. Basically, I was thinking to make like a kind of timeline or something like tracks editor or something like that.
Yeah.
And after talking with him, I completely ditched the idea,
Yeah.
but not because he told me, because I realized, oh, it's silly.
Right. Well, one of the things I was going to talk about just for a minute was, I started to say I don't feel like I contribute very much overall in the global scheme of things, but, compared to a lot of people that are doing awesome, amazing research papers and driving the industry forward. But, I think for just animation workflow and being able to see so many people have the same problems,
Mhm.
that is what I've incorporated into class for teaching rigging, and also the way I approach teaching is from a stance of, your goal is not to learn the software, your goal is to create with it. And if I'm just teaching software, then, as soon as the software changes, then that's not going to be of any use. So, I think the other Raf, with his Cult of Rig podcast and First Principles, has been an amazing resource. But I still find even people watching it going, "Oh, that's too deep for me. I don't understand it." And even though it is a first principle, this is the foundation of this stuff. It's still too much for people to get over that initial barrier of, I'm just trying to get a handle on understanding what,
Yeah.
it's an amazing resource, and I love that it's there, but we're to try to bring people along to that point has been something that, it's been a struggle, and it's been a struggle personally, and it's been a struggle with teaching people. But one thing I was going to say about the layers, and then I just wanted to mention that because I know we're kind of coming up on the hour mark, and I want to get to some questions. But one of the things about the animation layer system, and this is something that I created a workflow early on in Motion Builder that was for animators having this problem, right? Like they were doing mocap, but they wanted to have the freedom of keyframing. And, this is, no one else had been doing this that I knew of. And they were, I basically just reached out to me on LinkedIn or through email, like, "Hey, I know you've been doing Motion Builder stuff. Like, hey, can you help us out?" So, at the time it was just Story. The Story tool is the nonlinear tool, and when you make clips and do stuff, it allows you to keyframe into clips. And I'm going to kind of skip over that though and show animation layers, because this is when animation layers got built in Maya, my request was that the same functionality exists there that it does in here, which means that when I have, if I create an animation layer, here's my animation layer. If I create a new animation layer, this layer can be additive or it can be override, right? And an override means that this is basically like another take, right, or another timeline. And as soon as this animation layer has a keyframe on it, if I keyframe it on this layer, nothing exists anymore. And if I bring the weight down, now she's moving again, right? And let me actually go make a bigger change. So we'll come here and have her squat down. Okay. So, right now this is the base animation, and this animation layer, if we bring the weight back up, it's in control. It's got existing, nothing else exists beyond it because it's overriding everything. And so the thing that I discovered early on about Story and about the animation layers is being able to turn this weight down so that I can see what's happening here at the base. But keyframe into this layer allows me to basically grab any section of animation I want and only get the poses I need. So when we come back to talking about, I have a performance that's done and I need to edit it, well, I don't have to, let's say that you don't like the beginning, this beginning move looks rough, but the rest of it's fine. So starting here, I can select this animation layer and I can keyframe. And now I'm going to go forward a little bit, and I'm going to grab the next pose here, and that was an important pose. And maybe I'll just grab another breakdown. Um, Now I'm going to bring the weight up on this layer. So now this new override layer is in charge. So now I've got the same animation on this layer that I did on the base, except that it's reblocked into just 3 keyframes, and now I can retime it, I can readjust it however I need
I
to,
see. So
and
it's sorry.
I have clean poses from whatever mess I did down here.
Yeah, that's the way that normally they clean up the motion capture animation when it
Yeah,
comes. It's like you do it the other way around. So you start with a
right.
big amount of keys and you start
Yeah,
removing and clean up the tangents of the curves and so on. And here it will be the other way around. So you
yeah,
just
exactly.
cherry pick which pose do you want very
Exactly.
easily.
That's right. Yep. And
That's
then
amazing.
and and then you can step through and block it. And when I turn this in, if I mute this layer, then it's back to the original source. But if I turn this layer back on,
Yeah, definitely.
it's blocked, right? So now
Tomorrow,
I
yeah, I'm
can
gonna
grab
show
that
it on the
information.
studio.
But
Sure.
this layer weight, basically being able to tell the layer to not have any influence but accept the pose values, right? That when I keyframe into this layer, whatever this pose is, it stores it as an actual value on the layer. It doesn't get rid of it, right? So if I unmute it and I keyframe it, you can see that it actually stored the pose as is, right? If the layer's muted and I key it, it sets it to 0. It doesn't see it. So when the animation layers in Maya got created, I was like, listen, you have to allow those values to be written into the animation layer so that we can basically grab at any point the animation and key poses into it. And the reason that this came about as a pretty powerful tool is that, you know, with story or anything, if you're mixing live action and animation, if let's say the half of your shot is motion capture, but the beginning needs to be keyframed, um, trying to get that transition is a slow process if you're baking everything down all the time and you're having to delete keyframes and try to blend it in. But if you can just, you know, grab a few poses as key poses at the beginning and then basically set the weight back up, you know, for the first half of the animation, you can animate however you want. And then as soon as you get to that transition point, you drop the layer and you're back to pure mocap. You
That's
know,
great.
it allows at any point you can say, I'm not afraid of the data. I'm not afraid of having motion capture or simulation data, or I'm not afraid of my finished shot because I can go back in and recreate it and adjust it and blend it however I need to at any point without any other tools, without any support. I can just say, I want these poses and I want it separated from everything else. And
And
you're done.
and to be clear, that's not in Maya.
It is in Maya. So when they built the animation layers,
Oh,
if you
you can
create
do
an
it.
animation layer, yeah, if you create an animation layer and set the layer to override and you bring the weight down on the track in Maya, it has the same ability.
Oh,
It'll work this exact same way.
oh, I will check tomorrow. To be honest,
Yeah.
I don't animate that much in Maya. I should.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that's that. You know, when I made sure that got into those layers because it was such a powerful workflow
Yeah. Oh, that's
for me and
fantastic.
for animators and that I showed it to the guys at Epic because the Epic Game animators were working really hard to cook their rigs onto the art rig from Jeremy and to work through that process was a lot of waiting on the tool to bake, right? Waiting on Maya to cook the animation over to a new node, or, you know, I want to redo this stuff, but the rig is in an FK versus IK, and I don't like there's too many keys, and I don't know how it transitioned. Well, it doesn't matter. You can grab your poses without losing animation, and I don't have to go store a pose somewhere. I'm just creating pose to pose animation from a base source,
This
and
is
everything is in that pose, right? So
this is a super tip, man. This is thank you so much. I mean,
yeah, I try to share it whenever I can because
I
people don't know it.
it's
You know,
late
it's
night
not there.
here. If not, I will run to the studio to say it to everybody because we use motion capture. We have a motion capture like system quite big. We
Yeah,
can have like up to 6 persons, I think, on the same.
nice. Yeah,
And we heavily use motion builder, of course, but
yeah.
the big chunk of the animation is done in Maya. So
Yeah. Well, this works in
oh,
story too. So when you create if you insert a animation track here, If you pull this little down,
Oh, you
the
have that.
track has weight here too.
Yeah, I think in Maya the new tracks, how it's called, the animation. I don't
Yeah,
remember the
that
name.
time editor.
Yeah,
That
I
doesn't work the same way.
yeah, I
So
was
you have to
hoping
start.
you can do
Yeah,
that.
not yet anyway, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and the first thing I try to do is like few poses
yeah,
and just play around with the poses and see how I can interpolate and edit. And I
yeah.
realize I can barely do much apart of
It's certainly.
mixing like fade in, fade out.
Yeah, that could be a whole separate week in just discussion. But the time
Yeah.
editor, I think, for me, it still is knowing Motion Builder. It's hard, but if you start the time editor from scratch, if you basically work in the time editor from the beginning, it's fine. If you start trying to mix workflows, you're in
Oh,
trouble.
okay, I
It's
see.
not as smooth. So, anyway, that again, that just comes back to me starting as someone who looks at workflow and works at end product. And my experience with freelancing and working with different animators and studios, like that's what drives my teaching at Rigging Dojo. And so my rigging classes look a lot like, hey, here's a collection of resources that any student that comes through the class should be able to go back and learn from at any time. But when we're together and I've got a student with me, or if I'm at a studio, I want that time spent getting them to understand how to continue learning. And
Nice.
and that way, if they open up Blender or they open up Maya or have to learn Max or switch to Motion Builder, they understand how to approach it and how to think about what's happening behind the scenes. And if they never learn matrix math, that's fine. But if their love is deformation or their love is low poly characters, right? Like you may be fine with, or let me back that up even. If you see Raph doing this amazing hand-built system like craft rigging in his Cult of Rig series, but your studio has Maya LT and you have to turn around HIK rigs all the time, you should still be able to come out of my class with an understanding of how to make your process better,
Mm-hmm.
and with the idea and
Yeah.
knowledge that you
Yeah.
can push it so much further, right?
Yeah.
So
That's.
that's my approach to teaching over all these years has been, and to try to talk to Morgan's question from Twitter, just before I just want to get it before we run out of time, because he
Yes.
asked
Yes.
it,
Yes. Let's go
is
for the questions.
the my approach, either from training through Regan Dojo or working with individual students or studios, the process, the software, all the tools, have improved. The barriers to entry are lower. The information access is higher, but there's still a human trait of fear of making mistakes, a fear of not knowing something, a fear of what happens if I don't understand this. And so for me, teaching still is about working with the person to improve their individual level of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that, no matter what Maya does, right, it that doesn't change how I teach
Yeah.
in a sense. You understand? So,
Yes.
I think the other example of this is I can look at Maya caching and go, look, it's got all these new features and new tools. And yet, how many professional studios have jumped to Maya 2019? So if I'm always just chasing the next feature in the software to teach it, I'm doing a disservice to the students
Yeah.
that come to me that have already gone through all the training. They've already gone through all the video manuals, is what a lot of the tutorials are.
Mm-hmm.
It's a video version of the software documentation, right? Like
Yes.
a lot of the tutorials are, and that's needed, right? But you have to have an understanding of how to get something out of that for yourself. And so a
Yeah.
lot of the time I spend working with people is not about the software. It's about how to increase your confidence that if I make a mistake, it's not the end of the world, and how to recover when you've gone so far
Yeah.
down a path
Mm-hmm.
that it's not
Yeah.
just destroying everything, right?
L-
And
Like.
I wish that I was a better coder sometimes, because like but then you end up in pipeline.
Yeah. 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 That's dangerous.
Like there's
Yeah.
a balance, right? So and I think to me, um the from being again on the outside of so many studios, I don't have access to the resources and time of a full set of developers. I also don't have access to the tools most of the time, but every time I get a project, the same mistakes are repeated over and over again.
Mm.
there's joint placement issues, there are design issues, their animators are fighting with the rig because it's slow,
Mm-hmm.
because they overbuilt it, or they spent all
Yes.
this time and money building something that is going to be
Yeah.
seen in one
Same.
shot. So I continuously try to push people to understand it's about the finished product, but
Yeah.
you know, it's about the finished product in
Yeah. I totally
a way
agree.
that works.
Yeah, I know. If I can put another words, I think if I grasp
Yeah,
what
yeah,
it's basically. I mean, not to show how to rig following the steps A B C, but more
yeah.
to sh- to 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 show the people to train the people how to think to solve problems. And
Yes,
if you
yeah,
know how to solve problems, or to have the train of thoughts that you can solve problems, it doesn't matter which new challenge or new issue you come in to solve.
right.
It's not like if I didn't this before,
Yeah,
I can come with a solution by myself. It's not
right.
like copy, but more like
Yes.
creative thinking, focus
Yeah.
on rigging and animation. I
Yeah, and
think
that's that's still the human element, right? And that's,
yes,
I think we for me personally, like just showing you the layer trick, right? Like that is a software feature, quote unquote, but it was never intended to be used that way.
yeah,
I discovered it by trying to solve a problem for someone, and had I been afraid to even just explore the software and break some things,
yeah,
I would have never come across it.
yeah,
And so getting people that are new to something to put that fear aside and allow themselves to learn
yes,
is an extremely challenging problem because, you know, as an adult or even like a young adult who's in the industry, there's a lot of fear about like, oh, am I good enough? Am I just faking this? Well, yeah,
yeah,
absolutely, because we all are. And if I couldn't go ask someone smarter than me a question
yeah,
and be okay, be humble enough to go, yeah, I just don't know this. Can you help me out?
yeah.
And
I
then do something with that information and apply it,
mm-hmm,
because I don't need them
yeah,
to do it for me. I just need to be able to work through the problem.
yeah,
And every time I'm afraid of doing that, I suffer.
yeah,
Every time I get brave enough to go, you know what? I watch my kids learn how to do something without fear. Why
mm-hmm,
can't I do that with my software? Why can't
yeah,
I get that out of students that I work with?
yeah.
And
Uh,
that's what I continue
yeah.
to teach and haven't changed
The
from the beginning.
Yeah, the other day I saw a little video someone posted on Twitter.
Yeah.
Um, it was about I don't remember the concept, but was something like a kind of a negation bias to that you can do the things because
Yeah.
the way that it's like the educative system and everything everybody was trained on the school, it's
Right.
like you need to ask to do something.
Yes. Yeah.
You cannot make mistakes. You cannot
Right.
experiment,
Yeah. And
and sometimes like if you don't like make these mistakes or if you have like a supervisor
yeah.
and you always tend to ask everything to the supervisor,
Yep.
but probably some of the replies that you're gonna get if the supervisor is not there you cannot ask him
Right.
because you will come by yourself to this,
Yes.
but because
Yeah.
the people don't try it or
Well, and
they're biased to don't to ask.
a good example of this is, I took on this freelance project a little while ago, and I used some of your tools to work out some ideas, but I ended up not being able to. We were talking about like I had someone handed me an existing asset,
Mm-hmm,
and they didn't have control of the source because they were given the asset, and
mm-hmm,
so now I'm just left with whatever I'm given. I don't have a perfect situation. The mesh has got problems. The rigging tools don't quite work. I don't have budget to write my own. I don't have time to try to like work through all this stuff and make it perfect. And every time I'd iterate on it and give it back to them, they'd have all these other requests. And then, I talked to their supervisor and I said, look, I'm happy to keep working on this over and over again, but the shot that this is going to be used in, it doesn't look like it requires this much work. And so I don't want to waste your money and time and my effort into something that's going to get composited and put in the background. Like, am I missing something, or is the amount of feedback coming back on this single asset, this little slice, missing the big picture? And they're like, oh yeah, you're right. Okay, this is approved. But because I wasn't afraid to go, hey, I'm going
yeah,
to push back on this. And again, the end product, I see something that isn't matching with the amount of effort that's coming from your team and me because we're just looking at the single asset. I look at the shot and go, this doesn't seem like this is worth all this work. Can you get away with doing what you need with what I've done now? And we can save you money and they can get working. And the answer was yes. But had I not asked it, had I just gone, well, I'm going to keep rigging, and then I'd be late on everything else.
Yeah, I
And
can agree more with that.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that again, that comes back to when I have students approach how learning works. I'm like, okay, it's not about failing fast. It's about failing fearlessly.
Yeah.
It's about being accepting the fact that if I fail, it just means that I need to try something else, and that it's okay that I ask for help and that it's not perfect, because once you get over that fear, then you get done so much faster. You actually get to learn, you get to improve, you get to work on what's important, not work on your ego, not protect yourself
Oh,
and your feelings. You
yeah,
just
the
get,
ego is the
you
worst
just
thing.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not even intentional, right? You just feel like, oh, I have this imaginary expectation from someone else
Yeah.
that I have to be better.
Yeah.
And you don't. You just have to be good enough to keep working and push forward when you hit an obstacle. And so, that's for to answer Morgan's question, like the way I started teaching and the number of software versions and the number of bugs and the number of things that's I've never taught a software. I've never taught my specific workflow or technique. I try to teach over and over again the way I've discovered my process and what works for me, but I also try to give them a foundation of how to do that for themselves. The way you write code is going to be different than the way Josh writes code. The way your rig system, the way it builds and works is going to be different than another system. But if I'm not afraid and I understand that both systems start at a certain point and require expectations that this is done, I can explore it and try it, and it's not, it's not the end of the world. I don't go, well, I just don't know how to do this. I only know how to use this little section.
Yeah.
Like that's the continued challenge and that's why we still mentor people and not just hand them videos, because I want them to ask questions and I want them to challenge what I've given them, and I want them to say, well, do you mean this, or why aren't you doing this a certain way? And that conversation is the teaching.
Yes, exactly. This is something.
What platform we use is
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I want to put on something different, but in the same lines. It's sometimes when I am stuck with something on I go and start talking with a colleague.
Yep.
Start a conversation. I have this problem, and even just by talking, by expressing where is your like your problem or your
Yes.
issue, many times you come with a solution, just trying to explain where is the problem to
Right,
someone
because
so not even as helping, but I have this problem or this issue, I don't know how to do it, and I want to do this it's happened this, oh, wait a minute, oh, I know, thank you so much, and the other person is like, okay, thank you. You're welcome.
Right. Well, I think it allows you to put the connections in order, right? It lets you, as soon as you have to explain it to someone else, it lets you step outside of your own head, and it lets you look at the pieces. And when you hear yourself combine those ideas, you're like, oh, wait a second. Right. I get it now.
Yeah. Exactly.
or you know what to ask, right? You're like, oh, okay, I see. I need to ask this question. But
so that's what I'm saying. Like maybe to having a mentor, it's someone that you can explain your problem, but probably just because this act of explanation, you're gonna get better or gonna solve it yourself.
And sometimes the mentor's job is to get them to get that explanation out.
Yes, exactly.
Push past the fear. I have one more minute. If do we have any other questions from anybody?
I was checking the chat. We have Timothy. It's talking about the Cascader. I don't know if I pronounced correctly.
Oh yeah,
the software.
Yeah,
it's really nice. I did apply for the beta, but I didn't have the time to play around. It was
well, I looked at it a little bit, and again, I think what the software's potential is and what it could do, from limited experience, it's going to the stuff it's doing is not exclusive to what it's doing. I just think, again, they've interfaced an idea and a concept that exists other places, but they did a really nice job with visualizing and allowing, again, to separate poses from interpolation.
Yeah.
it's a very similar concept. It's just they're using the interpolation and pose separation through physics as opposed to you know, animation interpolation purely, right? They're pushing poses through physics interpolations and giving feedback about what the center mass should be versus you having to guess or having to like fake it. So,
Mm.
you know, I think it's powerful, but I'm curious to see how it integrates with everything else because what we talked about earlier, if I have to jump out of the software to go somewhere else, it's already a losing battle.
Yes, yeah, for me. It's,
Yeah.
and we have one more question.
Okay.
Do you have time or
Yeah,
it?
I can field
Yeah,
it, and then I'm gonna
it's
say thank you and good night to you and run around. But
yeah.
if we need to do a follow up, I'd be happy to talk more about something. But I appreciate the chance to talk to you, and I hope it's been helpful and useful to you and to the podcast listeners.
Yeah, I hope to. I mean, for me, it's. I mean, it's fantastic. I think there is a lot of nice information that you share with us, and also the super trick on the on the layers. It's like
Yeah,
it's a super candy, I will say.
that's good.
And but yeah, it was fantastic. Also talking about all times and how everything started, kind of.
Yeah,
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 because we are kind of first generation. I mean, on
yeah,
our jobs.
yeah.
If you think on that, it's amazing, man. It's
Yeah, it just means we're continuing to get older.
yeah. Well, I hope I continue getting older for many, many years.
Yes, me too, me too.
Yeah.
All right, what's our last question, and then
Sorry. Last question was, what are the future plans for Regan Dojo? And I think that's a
uh,
good one.
future plans, right? Well, so I still am looking for you know, a solution to help people learn and the best way possible, right? So the same way people are looking for character TDs, the future rigging dojo is we're still looking at what problems people are having over and over again, what they're able to learn without us, and what um, continues to be a struggle, and we try to fit that. So you know we are going to just continue to do what we've been doing, which is helping people find themselves and their path and connect people with jobs and connect people in the industry and continue to build a community about sharing knowledge as opposed to just doing tutorials. And that's the goal.
Yeah. I take note also because I'm working on a tutorial. I will try to rethink my objectives or my goals.
Awesome.
Thank
Well,
you
I
so much.
appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I look forward to listening to your other guests and keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All
Bye
right. Bye.
bye.